The United Nations chamber in New York was heavy with tension. Delegates whispered behind their placards, cameras flashed, and aides moved quickly through the aisles. Everyone knew this session would not be like the others. Israel's Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, had arrived with his usual confidence, chin high, tie perfectly straight, his words already prepared to justify his country's actions in Gaza. Across the hall, a different kind of presence sat silently, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the young president of Burkina Faso. When the session began, Netanyahu rose first. "Israel fights terrorists," he declared, his voice echoing across the chamber. "We fight for peace, for democracy, for civilization itself." He paused, scanning the audience for approval, but found only quiet faces. Then he raised his tone, "Those who criticize us are supporting terror. Those who stand against Israel stand with chaos." The words hit the hall like a storm, dividing the delegates. Some clapped weakly, others frowned in discomfort. But the camera panned to Traoré. He hadn't moved an inch. No applause. No reaction. Just the calm gaze of a man who had seen too much hypocrisy to be impressed by theatrics. When his turn came, he stood slowly. He didn't look at Netanyahu, he looked at the flags hanging above them. "Peace cannot exist where bombs fall on children," he began, voice low but steady. The hall grew still. "You call it defense. We call it destruction. You call it democracy. We call it domination." Netanyahu shifted in his seat. Traoré's words were not diplomatic, they were surgical. "You say you fight for civilization," Traoré continued, "yet your actions bury it under rubble." He paused, letting silence become his weapon. "You call yourself a protector. But the world sees a destroyer." For a moment, no one breathed. The young African leader had spoken what others feared to say. Cameras zoomed in on Netanyahu's face, tight jaw, forced smile. Traoré then looked directly at him for the first time. "Mr. Netanyahu," he said, "you came here expecting politicians. But what you face today is a soldier, one who fights not for power, but for truth." The room erupted. Some gasped, others applauded. The African delegation stood. The old order of silence had just been broken. Netanyahu sat back, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The applause that followed Traoré's speech was not polite, it was defiant. It echoed through the hall like thunder after lightning, and every clap carried the sound of rebellion. Journalists rushed to send their headlines, "African President Confronts Netanyahu at UN." The old man of war had just been challenged by a soldier half his age, and the world had seen it live. When the noise finally settled, Netanyahu leaned toward his aide. "He's just a boy playing hero," he muttered in Hebrew. "Let him speak. Africa always talks, it never acts." His aide nodded carefully, but his eyes betrayed uncertainty. The atmosphere had shifted, and Netanyahu knew it. Later, in the press corridor, reporters swarmed Traoré. Microphones flashed, voices overlapped. "Mr. President, are you accusing Israel of war crimes?" Traoré stopped, looked directly at the cameras, and answered calmly, "I'm accusing anyone who bombs children and calls it justice." The quote spread like wildfire. Within hours, millions had seen it. Hashtags exploded, hashtag Traoré speaks, hashtag truth at the UN, hashtag Africa rises. Across social media, people replayed the moment. Netanyahu's smirk faded, frame by frame, like the fall of an empire caught on camera. In Jerusalem, Netanyahu's advisors met in a flurry of frustration. "This cannot stand," one said. "He made Israel look weak." Another added, "He's becoming a symbol, the kind that spreads faster than facts." Netanyahu raised his hand for silence. "Then we'll remind him who controls the world stage," he said coldly. "Let's show him what happens when a soldier steps into politics." But in Ouagadougou, the atmosphere was entirely different. Crowds filled the streets waving Burkinabe flags, chanting Traoré's name. "He spoke for us," said an elderly man in the crowd. He spoke what the world was too afraid to say. That night, as Traoré watched the news in his office, he saw his own image replayed again and again, standing firm before the most feared politician in the Middle East. His aide entered quietly. "Sir, the people are calling you the voice of Africa." Traoré didn't smile. Voices are not enough, he said softly. It's time the world listened. He knew Netanyahu wouldn't forget this day, and neither would he. The stage was set for a confrontation that would go far beyond words. The next morning, newspapers across continents carried the same photograph, Netanyahu sitting stone-faced while Traoré stood before him, fist clenched at his side, eyes steady. Headlines read, Africa speaks back, Burkina Faso's leader defies Israel, the soldier who silenced Netanyahu. The image had become more than politics, it was a symbol. Inside the Israeli Prime Minister's office, silence filled the air. Netanyahu's closest aides stood still as he scrolled through the reports. His face tightened with every page. He turned a UN meeting into a battlefield, Netanyahu said bitterly. A battlefield where words cut deeper than bullets. An advisor replied cautiously, with respect, Sir, his speech is gaining global sympathy. People see him as brave. Brave? Netanyahu snapped. Bravery doesn't win wars. Power does. And we still have that. He stood, pacing the room. He wants to be a soldier. Then he'll learn what war feels like. Across the world in Burkina Faso, the mood was the opposite. Traoré walked through the courtyard of the presidential palace, greeted by chants from workers and soldiers. They called him Le Soldat du Peuple, the people's soldier. He shook their hands, his eyes calm but thoughtful. Courage, he told them, is not the absence of fear. It's choosing to face it anyway. Later that afternoon, an encrypted message arrived on his desk from a regional intelligence contact. The contents were simple but alarming: Israeli lobbyists pressuring Western allies to cut aid and isolate Burkina Faso. It was a clear retaliation, not through bombs, but through politics. Traoré read the report twice. So this is how they fight, he murmured. They starve what they can't silence. His advisor looked uneasy. Mr. President, should we issue a diplomatic response? No, Traoré said firmly. We'll issue a lesson. That evening, he met with ministers from Mali, Niger, and Guinea. Around the table were faces hardened by struggle, nations that had faced coups, sanctions, and constant interference. They fear one thing, Traoré said, pointing toward the window where the night sky glowed over Ouagadougou. An Africa that thinks for itself. We've spoken enough. It's time we act together. And as the meeting went on, plans began forming, plans that would challenge not just Netanyahu, but the entire balance of power that had ruled Africa for decades. For weeks, diplomatic circles buzzed with whispers. Netanyahu's government, furious over Traoré's defiance, began quietly lobbying Western powers to restrict trade and investment in Burkina Faso. Aid contracts were reviewed, partnerships paused. It was punishment disguised as procedure, the invisible hand of political revenge. But Traoré was no stranger to pressure. In the military, he had learned that survival was not about firepower, it was about adaptability. So while Western envoys debated, he moved silently. He sent envoys to Moscow, to Beijing, to Ankara, and even to Tehran. Within a month, Burkina Faso signed its first direct gold for energy deal, bypassing Western banks completely. When Netanyahu's advisors received the intelligence report, they couldn't believe it. He's linking Africa's gold to Asia's power, one whispered. This could change everything. Netanyahu slammed his hand on the table. Then change him. Meanwhile, at the presidential palace in Ouagadougou, Traoré studied a satellite image of Gaza projected on the wall: flattened homes, burning hospitals, children running through dust. He turned to his ministers. They say they fight for peace, he said. But peace without justice is the silence of the grave. He ordered a symbolic move: Burkina Faso would cut all remaining ties with any companies directly funding Israel's military industries. The announcement made international headlines. Western media called it provocative. African media called it historic. That night, Traoré addressed his nation. His words were simple but searing: they threaten us because we are no longer afraid. They isolate us because we no longer obey. But Africa's strength is not measured in weapons, it's measured in will. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu watched the speech live. He's turning this into a movement, an aide said nervously. Netanyahu's eyes darkened. Then we'll remind him what happens to movements. He leaned closer to the screen, staring at Traoré's face frozen mid-speech. He thinks he's fighting a man, Netanyahu muttered. But he's fighting a system. What he didn't realize, not yet, was that Traoré had already understood that truth. And he was building something stronger than any system, unity. Within weeks, the wave that began in Ouagadougou reached across Africa. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the speeches of Ibrahim Traoré were being replayed on street screens and smartphones. His words, "Africa will no longer kneel," had become a rallying cry for a generation raised under the shadow of Western power. In Addis Ababa, during an emergency session of the African Union, delegates from 17 nations requested that sanctions against Burkina Faso be denounced as economic warfare. The hall erupted in applause when Traoré entered. He wasn't dressed in a Western suit, he wore his military uniform, dusty from travel, sleeves rolled up. A soldier among diplomats. When he spoke, the room fell silent. "They call us rebels," he said, his voice echoing through the chamber. "But if defending our land, our people, and our dignity makes us rebels, then may every African be one." From the back of the room, an Ethiopian delegate whispered, "This man speaks like Sankara reborn." Another replied, "No, he speaks like the future." As news of the speech spread, Netanyahu held a private meeting with Western defense contractors. "He's turning resistance into currency," one of them said. "Every word he says strengthens Africa's defiance." Netanyahu exhaled slowly. "Then maybe it's time we make him an example." Meanwhile, Traoré convened a secret meeting in Ouagadougou with his closest allies, military leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea. They sat around a dimly lit map table, the smell of sand and engine oil in the air. "They'll try to isolate one of us," Traoré warned. "If they do, we all answer together." The men nodded. "If they come for one," said the Malian general, "they'll face all." As they shook hands, the weight of centuries seemed to shift. It wasn't just about Burkina Faso anymore. It was about every nation that had been mined, divided, and deceived, every people who had been told to obey or starve. In the corner of the room, a soldier captured a single photo of the handshake, for leaders under one light, their faces carved with resolve. That image would later circle the world with one caption, "The Alliance of the Unbroken." And when Netanyahu saw it on the front page of Le Monde, he felt something he hadn't in years, unease. Inside his compound in Jerusalem, Netanyahu stared at the photo on the screen, Traoré and 3 African generals standing shoulder to shoulder, eyes burning with defiance. The caption below it read, "The Alliance of the Unbroken." He zoomed in on Traoré's face, his expression unreadable, his resolve unmistakable. "He's building an army of belief," Netanyahu muttered. "And belief is more dangerous than weapons." His national security advisor entered quietly. "Sir, our intelligence confirms a joint African defense agreement under negotiation. If finalized, it would block several Western defense companies and reroute resource contracts to Asia." Netanyahu frowned. "He's cornering the market. That boy is turning Africa into a fortress." "Do you want us to intervene economically?" the aide asked. "No," Netanyahu said coldly. "Economics take time. Fear works faster." He picked up the phone. Within hours, headlines began spreading, "Burkina Faso at risk of civil conflict, sources warn of internal division." Western media outlets painted Traoré as a reckless populist, a soldier out of control. But in Ouagadougou, Traoré watched the reports with a calm smile. "They've run out of arguments," he said. "Now they create ghosts." His advisor, Amara, frowned. "They're trying to isolate you. Europe, the US, even the UN Security Council, they're questioning your legitimacy." Traoré stood, his eyes fixed on the national flag behind him. "If legitimacy comes from the approval of those who stole our freedom," he said, "then I prefer to be illegitimate." Later that night, as he addressed a gathering of African youth leaders, he said something that would echo far beyond the continent: "You can sanction our banks, block our aid, and smear our names, but you cannot stop an idea whose time has come. Africa will not ask for permission to exist. Across the world, those words hit harder than any threat. In universities, in protest rallies, in refugee camps, young people quoted him. Memes spread faster than the lies. #WeAreUnbroken trended for days. Netanyahu's plan to sow fear had backfired. The fear wasn't in Africa anymore. It was in Tel Aviv. Because power, when confronted by truth, always trembles first. Weeks passed, and what had begun as a political feud was now turning into a global power shift. Western capitals scrambled to contain the Traoré effect. France, the United States, and Israel coordinated new sanctions targeting Burkina Faso's trade, banking, and mineral exports. But what they didn't anticipate was that Africa had already begun to close ranks. In Bamako, Niger, and Conakry, leaders signed off on a regional economic pact that bypassed Western currency systems altogether, a move that stunned financial analysts. For the first time in modern history, a network of African states was trading resources directly, using gold reserves and national currencies instead of dollars or euros. When Netanyahu was briefed, his fury was immediate. "They're using their gold as a weapon," he said. And Traoré handed them the sword. In Ouagadougou, Traoré sat with his economic team, analyzing charts and figures projected across the wall. "We've lost European buyers," said his finance minister nervously. "Our exports dropped 30% this quarter." Traoré didn't flinch. "Let them go," he said. "We'll sell to those who respect us, not those who own us." At that moment, a call came in from Beijing. A deal was finalized, a long-term gold and infrastructure partnership worth billions. Within 72 hours, Russia, Turkey, and even India followed suit. Western sanctions had not weakened Burkina Faso, they had pushed it into a new orbit. When the news broke, European markets panicked. "Africa redraws trade map," read the Financial Times. "Burkina Faso defies the West." In a private conference room in Tel Aviv, Netanyahu's inner circle debated their next move. "He's turning your enemies into his allies," one strategist warned. "Every time we isolate him, he grows stronger." Netanyahu rubbed his temples. "Then maybe we stop fighting the soldier," he said grimly. "And start targeting the idea." But the idea was already unstoppable. In the streets of Nairobi, Dakar, and Accra, murals of Traoré appeared overnight, the young soldier holding a shovel instead of a gun, standing atop broken chains. Below it, a simple phrase, "Africa digs its own future." And as the sun rose over Ouagadougou that morning, Traoré looked out his window and whispered, "Let them sanction us. Every blow only sharpens the blade." It wasn't just politics anymore, it was a war for truth. Western media, pressured by powerful lobbies, painted Traoré as a radical populist and Putin's puppet. Editorials accused him of destabilizing Africa and jeopardizing global order. But none of it matched the scenes unfolding on the ground. In the heart of Ouagadougou, thousands of people gathered every night in Unity Square. They carried torches, not in protest, but in pride. They sang songs of freedom, their voices echoing into the night, "Africa will rise, and they will remember our names." Traoré watched from the balcony of the presidential palace, the crowd's chants reverberating like drums of history. His communications director approached him. "Mr. President, the attacks against you are multiplying. CNN, BBC, Le Monde, they're all calling you dangerous." He smiled faintly. When a slave breaks his chains, the master always calls him dangerous. In Tel Aviv, Netanyahu watched those same images, African crowds chanting for Traoré, waving flags of countries once colonized by the West. His advisors looked uneasy. "He's winning hearts faster than we can win headlines," one admitted. Netanyahu slammed the table. "He's turning rebellion into theater. Then let's rewrite the script." The next day, a fabricated story emerged in international media. Burkina Faso funding armed militias in West Africa. It was a calculated lie, planted to fracture the alliance Traoré had built. Western ambassadors began quietly withdrawing from Ouagadougou. But Traoré was prepared. At a live press conference, he exposed the false documents, revealing proof of Western fabrication. Holding them up before the cameras, he said, "They fear not our armies but our awakening. They don't fight with truth, they fight with illusions." The broadcast went viral. Within 24 hours, hashtags flooded social media again, #AfricaAwakens, #TruthIsOurWeapon, #Traoré unmasked the West. Even journalists who once ignored him began to reconsider. The Guardian wrote, "He may be the most underestimated leader of our time." That night, as thunder rolled over the Sahel sky, Traoré met with his generals. "They will try to silence us again," he said quietly. "But remember, every empire falls twice. First in the world. Then in the mind. And this time, it was their minds he was winning." By the time autumn swept across the Sahel, Traoré's defiance had become legend. His face appeared on murals from Lagos to Johannesburg, painted alongside Sankara, Lumumba, and Nkrumah, the revolutionaries who once dreamed of a united Africa. Except this time, it wasn't just a dream. In the capital, the air buzzed with tension. Western embassies had reduced staff. Israeli advisors whispered to European partners that Burkina Faso was turning rogue. Sanctions deepened, fuel shortages bit harder, and propaganda flooded every screen. But the people didn't yield. Instead, they marched. Teachers, farmers, miners, soldiers, men and women of every tribe filled the streets with flags raised high. On their banners, 3 words blazed in red paint: "Africa stands free." From his balcony, Traoré watched the procession snake through the city. His advisor Amara joined him, voice low but proud. "They say the world's against us, yet look at them, they die before kneeling." Traoré nodded. "Because they know this isn't just politics. It's dignity." That same evening, Netanyahu appeared on international television. His tone was fierce, almost desperate. "This so-called African independence movement is being manipulated by foreign powers," he declared. "It threatens stability. It threatens peace." Minutes later, Traoré gave his reply, live from Ouagadougou. Dressed in his uniform, back straight, voice steady, he said, "You speak of peace while Gaza burns. You speak of stability while Africa starves under your debts. The era of your hypocrisy is ending." The world paused. It wasn't just a rebuttal, it was a reckoning. In the days that followed, global protests erupted, in London, Paris, and New York. Young activists held signs reading, "Listen to Traoré." For the first time in decades, Africa wasn't following a conversation, it was leading one. Meanwhile, in Jerusalem, Netanyahu threw a report onto his desk. "Every speech he gives spreads faster than our entire media campaign." His aide whispered, "Sir, he's not just fighting anymore. He's inspiring." Netanyahu's silence said it all. He had waged wars, toppled governments, and silenced nations, but how do you fight an idea? Because somewhere between defiance and hope, Traoré had stopped being a man. He had become a movement. The sun was setting over Ouagadougou, bleeding gold across the horizon. From the roof of the presidential palace, Ibrahim Traoré watched the sky blaze like a flag, red for struggle, gold for sacrifice, green for hope. Below, chants echoed from the city, "Africa is awake. Africa is free." He closed his eyes for a moment. The road to this moment had been carved with threats, betrayals, and sanctions, yet he stood, not as a survivor, but as a symbol. The soldier who had faced the world and refused to kneel. Inside, his generals and ministers awaited his speech. Cameras were ready, live feeds already connected to global networks. As he stepped into the hall, the air shifted. Even his enemies would be watching. Traoré took the podium. His first words were quiet, too quiet, until the silence became heavier than thunder. They tried to starve us, he said. They tried to isolate us. They even tried to erase us. But we stood. He lifted his gaze. We are not fighting Israel. We are not fighting America. We are fighting a system that believes Africa's wealth must serve others before its own. That era ends tonight. Every sentence landed like a strike. To those who bomb children and call it defense, to those who steal gold and call it aid, to those who fear a free Africa, he paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air. Know this, your fear is justified. In living rooms from Lagos to London, millions watched in stunned silence. Even in Jerusalem, Netanyahu's advisors looked uneasy as his face hardened on the screen. Traoré's voice rose one last time. They said a soldier could not lead a nation. But a soldier knows something politicians forget, that freedom is not negotiated, it's defended. The hall erupted in applause. Outside, fireworks exploded over the Capitol, lighting up the night in bursts of red and gold. Later, as Traoré stood once more on the palace balcony, Amara approached him. Mr. President, she said softly, you've changed everything. Traoré looked down at the people, thousands of torches flickering like stars. No, he said quietly. They did. And as the crowd roared his name, the soldier who had faced Netanyahu, and the entire world, finally smiled. Because Africa was no longer a continent in waiting. It was a continent in command.